The conversation about poverty is a conversation that we often ignore, that we often sidestep, that we often sanitize or deodorize so that we don't have to wrestle with the fact that we live in a nation that is indeed the richest empire in human history, and yet continues to have children who go to bed hungry every night. That we continue to invest in jails instead of jobs. We celebrate and protect the rights of billionaires to the expense of the hundreds of millions of people who wallow in poverty precisely because we live in a system that allows mass hoarding of wealth. This is about telling the truth. You see, it's not enough to just acknowledge the poor. If we are to truly disrupt, to be disruptive, we got to change the conversation. We got to have a different conversation. So one of the things I want to do today is talk about how we can disrupt the conversation on poverty, specifically by talking about how poverty lays at the intersection of so many of our social problems. See, we can't talk about poverty in isolation. We can't say, well, we have poverty, we have racism, we have militarism, we have sexism, we have homophobia, we have transphobia. All those things are true, but we can never ignore the fact that so many of the challenges and contradictions of American empire exist because we live in a state that at the core defends class at all costs. If you ain't gonna have that conversation, you ain't gonna get nowhere. I was in the Midwest not too long ago. I don't come here too much. I don't stay too long. After October, it's a tough place to be. I mess with y'all from May to September. But I was in St. Louis, and I was there because we were acknowledging the 5th anniversary of the death of Michael Brown. And I continue to go back to Ferguson, Missouri, and St. Louis, and all the other surrounding towns. Because in many ways, the death of Mike Brown on August 9th, 2014, laid bare America's contradictions around poverty. For many people, it was a conversation about state violence. Of course it was. For many, it was a conversation about racism. Of course it was. But the story of Mike Brown becomes a story of the contradictions of American economic injustice. I was sitting in Philadelphia watching on television when they said Mike Brown had been killed, and I gotta be honest with you, at first it didn't strike me. Whole lot of black folk die. Whole lot of poor folk die. But they kept showing it over and over and over and over again. And after about 3 or 4 hours, his body was still on the ground. 4.5 hours, Mike's body was on the ground. We see it in Milwaukee. It happens in Milwaukee. It happens in Chicago. It happens in Philadelphia. It happens in New York. But they left him there for 4.5 hours. So I flew out there to cover the story. And when I got to Camfield Court, I could still see the blood on the ground. You could still smell the stench of death in the air. You could look at a town that had been traumatized by a 21st century lynching. See, the lynching wasn't about killing the body. You could kill the body behind the scenes. You could kill the body when nobody's looking. You could kill the body when it's sitting on his own couch. But the lynching was about the spectacle that let you know this is what happens to all of you all if you challenge state power. So I looked at that town that was traumatized by the death of Mike Brown, and I walked over to a girl, and she said they left him out there for 4.5 hours, and she was right. His body lay out there. They didn't even put a sheet over him for 2 hours, and the sheet, almost a metaphor for America's failure to protect him with the safety net. The sheet didn't fit his whole body. They pulled it over his face, and his feet stuck up. They pulled it down, and his head stuck up. The flies and the buzzards were in the air from the death in the air. They said they left him out there like he ain't belong to nobody. Like he ain't belong to nobody. No state to protect him, no medical establishment to invest in him. He was disposable. There's a politics of disposability that governs the poor in America. What we don't invest in, we throw away. We hide. We stigmatize. We marginalize. We criminalize. We pathologize. We do everything but invest. So in many ways, the story of Mike Brown is a story about the contradictions of poverty in America. Long before he lay on the ground in Canfield, Mike Brown went to Normandy School District, one of the most compromised school districts in the country, not because teachers don't care, teachers care everywhere. But we continue to expand the logic of right to work. In certain places, I ain't gonna say no names, that strips educators of their economic protection, that destabilizes and casualizes their labor, that de-skills their labor, that turns them from a force that we need to invest in to produce the next generation of great thinkers into darn near part-time employees who we see as robots. This is part of an economic contradiction. But we've bought into this logic in America that poor people deserve poor schools. So we have an economic structure that says that property taxes determine the distribution of resources. So if you don't pay a lot for your house, you don't pay a lot of taxes. And because you don't pay a lot of taxes, you don't get a good school. And because you don't get a good school, you don't get a good education. And because you don't get a good education, you don't get a good job. And because you don't get a good job, you are poor. And so we continue to reproduce structural inequality through education. We got to disrupt that conversation because we like to pretend that that's not the case. We like to pretend that we live in a country where you can be anything you want, you can be everything you want. If you just go to school and work hard, you'll be just fine. Stop lying. Yes, hard work is rewarded. Hard work is its own reward. Yes, if you work your hardest, you can be better than if you don't work hard. Of course that's true. Of course there are poor people who elevate through the American economic echelon and they make it to the top. But those are the exceptions. You shouldn't have to be extraordinary to have a living wage. You shouldn't have to be extraordinary to have food. That's what it means to be human. But we have economic structures that don't allow for that. Mike Brown was abandoned long before he met that police officer, Darren Wilson. He was abandoned by an education system that doesn't distribute resources in ways that really allow this American experiment in democracy to be genuine. Because the American democratic experiment holds as its goal that everyone can be successful. That the Protestant work ethic can be rewarded, that courage and ingenuity and talent are the driving forces. But it simply isn't the case. Mike Brown was walking down the street after leaving a store. We'll get back to the store. Mike Brown was stopped. People think Mike Brown was stopped for stealing a cigarillo, a cigar, a blunt, a Dutch, a L. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. Some of y'all can't wait to get home. Look, talk about poverty is stressful. But Mike was stopped for jaywalking. Mike Brown was stopped for jaywalking. For jaywalking, for jaywalking, for jaywalking. Why? Because a town like Ferguson doesn't have municipal resources. Remember, poverty is a structural issue. And so part of what happens is when a town like Ferguson doesn't have resources, and part of why Ferguson doesn't have resources is because of capital flight. What kind of capital flight? They had Emerson Electric. They had big factories and corporations in Ferguson in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Now those things went to the Far East. There's no jobs in Ferguson. There's no resources in Ferguson. So one of the things they do is they emphasize small crimes as a means of collecting court fees to pay bills, and police officers aren't fighting crime, they become tax collectors. So now you got poor people being stopped for jaywalking, and they double down on the warrants you get when you don't pay the jaywalking ticket. They give you a parking ticket that got to be paid within 6 to 8 days when everybody get paid once a month, every 2 weeks. They know what they doing. They ain't slow with this. So now you got people walking up and down the street trying to just get home. And instead of getting home, you get stopped for jaywalking. Imagine if we stopped everybody in New Trier, Illinois for jaywalking, or Lower Merion, Pennsylvania, or Hollywood, California for jaywalking. If we stopped everybody who jaywalked for jaywalking, we would need more prisons. But in a town like Ferguson, everybody got a warrant. Did you know, as of 2015, 80% of people in Ferguson had warrants of some sort? Now, some were small warrants, jaywalking, parking tickets. Some were bigger. But imagine living in a town where the town business is criminalizing folk. And who are the primary victims of this? Poor people. They're not stopping investment bankers for jaywalking. Now, they don't look you on the street and size you up. It's a circumstantial thing. I'm driving, you walking. I'm vulnerable, you're less vulnerable. So, the death sequence that it begins with Mike Brown walking down the street is linked to a set of economic conditions that overdetermine, that is to say, they construct and shape the social and cultural conditions out of which the criminological conditions emerge. What gets criminalized? Damn, it's tough to be poor in 2019. People say, well, Mike Brown shouldn't have stolen that cigar. Maybe. I'm not defending theft. I think we shouldn't steal from people. But there's a way that we justify and legitimize the death of the vulnerable. Stealing a cigar is a misdemeanor. It's not a capital crime. You don't get the death chamber. You don't get executed. There's no firing squad for it. But when it comes to the poor, we assign to them such a high bar of respectability and perfection that unless they meet that level, we don't allow them to make mistakes. We don't allow their deaths to be avenged. We don't assign to them justice. That's why whenever there's death on the table for a vulnerable black or brown person, particularly a poor black or brown person, we always like to put them on a horse or show their graduation photo or say they were going to college next year or they didn't have any drugs in their system. All that is cool, but you should not have to be perfect. You should not have to be going to Harvard. You shouldn't have clean urine just not to die. Because what it does is it normalizes the idea that the poor are a criminal class, a pathological class. He had drugs in his system. What weed in your system got to do with getting shot? But it's how we construct this. Because if we continue to frame the poor as inherently pathological, we're then able to justify their criminalization. So when you look in the poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee and you look in the poor neighborhoods in Detroit or Chicago and you see this broken windows policing, this idea that if we just have a heavier police presence, if we can stop the small crimes won't become big crimes. If people see a broken window and they don't fix it, they'll break another window. So there's a relationship between crime and disorder is what the sociologists would say. The actual framework is that suggests there's a relationship between crime and disorder, and that if we can get rid of disorder, we can get rid of crime. That's why you tell the guy to get up off the corner, you put the 40 in the bag, you tell people not to hang around the street. If we can just clean the thing up, we'll look all right. The problem is when you subject this to any kind of sociological scrutiny, what you realize is the thing that we're calling disorder is actually poverty and race. So we're not actually cleaning up, we're not policing disorder, we're policing blackness and brownness and poorness. And so this heightened police presence in our neighborhoods makes us feel like an occupied people. We widen the net of criminality. We find more stuff to lock people up for, and then we deepen the net. We make the penalties of these new crimes even greater. This is the reality of what it means to be poor and policed. So instead of actually stopping major crimes, folk like Eric Garner get stopped for selling Lucy's. People like Alton Sterling get into violent interactions because they get stopped by police, not for selling cocaine, not for carrying around guns, but for what? He was selling CDs. Ain't nobody selling CDs in 2014 causing no problems. Who's even buying a CD in 2014? I got that new Jodeci. And yet, this is where we focus our priorities. And then once you get ensnared into the system as a poor person, and getting ensnared by the criminal justice system is even more likely if you go to those broken schools we just talked about. You're forced to take a plea. We no longer have a system of trials, we have a system of pleas. And poor people are often encouraged to take a plea. They're often punished for not taking a plea. Innocence or guilt ain't even in the conversation anymore. If you can't afford a private lawyer, you're often encouraged to take a plea whether you did it or not. And now the public defender's office, like every other part of our country and our nation, is being privatized. So around the nation, you often have contract lawyers that are doing the work of public defenders, and they're taking on large amounts of clients for the same amount of money, which means essentially the more time they spend on you, the less efficient it is economically for them. So they don't want to pay for investigators. They don't want to pay for detectives. They don't want to pay for more research. They don't want to pay for backups, not because they don't care, but because they're also ensnared in a system that says that the private interest is better than the public good. And that belief that the private interest is better than the public good marks this moment that many people talk about as neoliberal. This idea that we want to privatize everything. Public schools, public housing, public options in healthcare, public transportation. And we buy into it. We start to believe that if we can just make everything competitive, if we can just put everything on the market, we'll be okay. Oh, some of us will be okay, but the poor will not. Now, how do you convince a public? How do you convince a public to reject the public in deference to the private? See, this is part of the bizarre but captivating logic of the moment. There's 548 billionaires in America. I remember I was having this debate on my Facebook page, man. Someone, I think it was Bernie Sanders, that said, like, we don't need billionaires. And folk was like defending this to the death. We need billionaires. If I do my best and I get this work done and I come up with this next great idea, I create this app, I might be a billionaire, and I don't want you coming for my money. I'm like, bruh, it's 12 black billionaires in the world. The odds are you won't be one. This ain't no disrespect to you. But the safe money is not on you being a billionaire or anybody being a billionaire. It ain't even about your talent. It just don't work that way. But we've convinced the vulnerable to protect the interests of the mighty to their own peril. This is the logic. And we've done the same thing with the privatization of the public good. We convince people that the public is bad. How do you make the public bad? You racialize it. You racialize poverty so that when people think public, they think black. When they think public education, they ain't thinking about the suburban schools. When they think of public transportation, they're not thinking of those railways that are operating outside the city. When they think of public, what do you call it when you get welfare? Public assistance. They're not thinking of Tiffany and Becky. They thinking of Taquanda and Precious. And so by having you think that despite the fact that white women are the biggest recipients of welfare in the country, they have you think that when you voting against this, you ain't voting against them. Remember back in the 80s when they had oh my God, there's the welfare queen. Next up on Donahue. They'd make all kinds of pathological narratives about black and brown women. She's going to 5 states collecting welfare checks every month. She's making millions off welfare. She's got 3 kids, 5 baby daddies. So that by the time you go into that voting booth, the very people who need it the most are closing ranks not around their economic conditions, but around the psychological wages of whiteness. Yeah, we can't talk about poverty without also talking about the intersection of race. This is what Du Bois was talking about in Black Reconstruction in 1935. When Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction, in that first chapter, he's talking about the slave, and then he talks about the planter. He talks about the white worker and then the planter, and he asks the question, why would a white worker support slavery? If you're a white worker and you're trying to get a fair wage and there's enslaved Africans, let's not call them slaves. We always say enslaved Africans. Slaves weren't brought to America, people were, and they were enslaved. And these enslaved Africans are here and they work for nothing. As long as there's an enslaved African working for nothing white worker, you are going to be priced out the market. It is to your advantage to not have slavery. So why are you siding with the bosses? Why are you siding with the managerial class? Why are you siding with the planters? He said because they accumulate the psychic wages of whiteness. Whiteness as property. Chris Rock said, I'm going to ride this white thing out and see where it takes me. So you end up with folk voting their fears and their anxieties and not their interests. To restore the public good, everybody in this room has to be committed to addressing our condition, not our fears, not our anxieties. We have to destroy this obsession with whiteness. We have to commit ourselves to believing that other worlds are possible. Worlds where people who are vulnerable advance their own interests, and those who side with the vulnerable support their interests, even at the expense of a little bit of comfort. It's hard, man. Because part of what we've done is not just privatize the public interest, but we've criminalized the public interest. We've taken all of our resources and we've doubled down on a prison so that the poor are subject to criminalization as opposed to medical intervention, social intervention. See, people don't commit crimes. Crime is a social construct. What'd that mean? People don't commit crimes, they commit acts. And acts get criminalized. Smoking weed, even when we joke about smoking weed, I can't get no speech 20 years ago joking about smoking weed. Y'all be freaking out right now. Most of y'all. Y'all at least pretend to be. In many states, it's no longer a crime. But it was a crime. Black people learning to read was a crime. Now it's not a crime. Now some stuff still is a crime. I get you. Killing people is a little different. But my point is that what we decide to criminalize and how we respond to these things is part of a broader system that has decided that we're not going to invest in the vulnerable. Instead, we are going to erase the vulnerable, the politics of disposability. Think about mental institutions in the 60s and the 70s. Beginning under Carter and really hitting its stride under Reagan, we decided that we were no longer going to invest in mental health. So, people who were in mental institutions are now on the street. And then we made it illegal to be on the street. I mean, think about the 80s. Think about all the local, think about New York or Philadelphia or cities where we said, oh my God, we're gonna make crimes, laws against homelessness. So they don't say laws against homelessness. They just do things that are facially neutral but affect the poor disproportionately. Laws against public camping. I would bet my last dollar not one middle-class white family, the Swiss Family Robinson, they never get locked up for having them canteens outside. It was for poor people. It was for homeless people. Public drunkenness, public urination, the catch-all of disorderly conduct, which could be anything you want it to be at any time. Used to take people who were in mental institutions who are now on the street and to take them from the street as part of that broken windows logic, we're going to clean up the disorder by taking them off the street so that we don't have this blot on our public image. So now these people who are on the street are now in prison. We have effectively criminalized mental illness. We have criminalized homelessness. We have criminalized poverty. We have criminalized addiction, because many of those people who are on the street had to self-medicate now. And at the same time that they're on the street self-medicating, this magical thing called crack happens to hit the street, which is cheaper and easy to access. And at the very same time that crack is hitting the street, we double down on Nixon's war on drugs under Reagan, and we continue. So we now are criminalizing not drugs, but drug users. And by any estimation, we lost the war on drugs because we have spent trillions with a T, and drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and stronger than ever. So what we essentially did was transcarcerate people from a mental institution to a penal institution. We've taken people from shelters and we've put them into prison. We have taken people who need mental resources and supports, and we have pathologized and criminalized them. So it's no surprise that 80 or somewhere between 60 and 80% of people in state prisons and in federal prisons have a mental illness. And then you come out already poor, struggling with mental illness, probably still have the addiction. And then you can't get a job. You can't access public housing because we don't care about public housing. We're stripping away rent control. We're gentrifying neighborhoods. The only public housing that we've consistently invested in is the prison. So, are you a citizen? Are you legible on this democratic social contract? Who are you? More importantly, who are we? 80% of people in our nation's jails, they haven't been sentenced. They just can't afford bail. They're in jail because they don't have enough money not to be in jail. That's evil. It's evil. So we direct the poor to prison. We directly put the poor in prison. We criminalize them. And we create few alternatives to prison. And then we create economic structures so that the wealthy and the middle class, quite frankly, get paid off the prison. People say, oh, we got to get rid of for-profit prisons. Stop the liberal bullshit. All prisons are for profit. Every single one of them. Because even if it ain't a privatized prison with direct economic incentives that some of y'all favorite billionaires have interests in, y'all love them so much. You got regular state prisons where the whole town works at the prison. And your cousins right here get sent upstate to that prison where they now count as residents of that town, so that town gets more resources. That town gets more political representation. That town gets more jobs. That town is living off the exploitation of your cousins who go into the prison and are working for pennies on the dollar. Pennies on the hour. Phone companies charging them $5 a minute. We're dying, family. The poor are dying. All of us are dying. To be human is to die. Let me get that straight. We all dying. Nobody makes it off this planet alive. But the poor, we are standing still, so many of us, while the most vulnerable among us are being killed directly and indirectly by the state. The question at this point, quite frankly, what are we going to do? 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 Who do we want to be? We can't claim innocence. Not anymore. We know too much. We've studied too much. We've struggled too much. We've organized too much. We've led too much. We've built too much. We've taught too much. We know. The question now is simply, what are we willing to do for freedom and justice? We got to organize. It's great for us to be in this room at a conference. But then we have to be willing to leave this room and go back home. You can't struggle on behalf of the oppressed. We have to organize and be led by the oppressed. We got to be willing to go into the spaces where the vulnerable are most vulnerable and engage them, but let them lead us. Let them teach us. Let them organize us. Provide the resources and get out the way. Stop saying you want to give voice to the voiceless. If you want to give voice to the voiceless, pass the damn mic and move out the way. You got to be willing to have self-reflection. What are my contradictions? How is my male privilege shaping how I understand the poor? Am I obsessing about the ways that black men get incarcerated and ignoring the way that black women get incarcerated? Or the way that black women are getting evicted? Or the way that trans women are getting criminalized? Or the way that queer youth are getting pushed outside of their homes? What's my self-critique? What must I do differently? How can I give away this privilege? How can I stop being an ally and become a co-conspirator? But also, hope. Hope is the thing that keeps us going. I ain't talking about optimism. No. Not optimism. Optimism is immature. Optimism is unsophisticated. Optimism is the belief that everything's just gonna be all right. If somebody can buy an NFL team or somebody can open the world's biggest movie stage, we can make enough money to fix everything. That we can elect our way to freedom. Optimism is the belief that everything's going to just be all right. Now, we are going to be all right. We're going to win. Let me be very clear about that. But our victory doesn't come by believing that everything is just going to be okay. Hope says something different. Hope acknowledges the obstacles. Hope acknowledges the structure. Hope says that within this particular economic organization, this economic formation, we can never have justice. As long as there's mass billionaires, there will be mass poverty. As long as there's gross inequality in the world, we got to locate it. I get that. Hope says that all of that is true. Hope says that the world won't be perfect. Hope says that we may not see the victory in our lifetime or in our children's lifetime, but that the struggle itself is worthwhile because somebody did it for us. Somebody died for us. Somebody sacrificed for us. Somebody struggled for us. So we will hope against the odds, and we will know that we can win when we organize, when we analyze, when we collectively work together, when we critically reflect. We can see something on the other side, and we will be courageous enough to fight for it, courageous enough to struggle for it, courageous enough to die for it, courageous enough to celebrate. When the victory is finally ours, and it will be. It must be. Because everybody in this room is committed to it. Everybody in this room is committed to going back to your communities, going back to your institutions, going back to your schools, going back to your families, and speaking the truth even when it's bitter. And I know, and I'm going to take my seat, I know it's hard. Because you do get tired. We long distance runners, or we trying to be. The whole reason we have conferences like this, partly just so you can see that there's other people that's struggling too. There's other people who are hurting too, other people who, they're not losing faith, but faith is being tested. You know what, hell, sometimes you are losing faith. You feel alone. I know you feel alone. Everybody's fine talking about liberal reform. But when it comes time for radical change, don't nobody want to talk. I know you feel alone. Some folk are willing to talk economic justice, but when the question of race comes up, they disappear. I know you feel alone. Some of these folk are fine talking about race and maybe even gender, but when it comes to LGBT issues, suddenly nobody has anything to say. I know you feel alone. Some of y'all love black people. You love poor people. You love vulnerable people when they're on your website and they're on the brochure, but when it's time to hire one or be led by one or be mentored by one, you can't find them nowhere. I know you feel alone. But alone is what you're supposed to feel. There's never been a moment in history where the majority from the beginning has led us to justice. It's always been a small few. Harriet was alone. Sojourner was alone. Angela was alone. Asada was alone. Malcolm was alone. Nelson was alone. They all were alone. And you gonna be alone. And you gonna be alone. But we gonna come together and turn those alone people into a collective of freedom fighters that will win, that will be victorious, that will defeat poverty, that will produce justice, free the land, free all political prisoners. Yo to the noobs.
Circle or minus? Whoa. Whoa. For real, whoa. So while we're getting, Mark. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We had to do a lot to get these keynotes here, but we were so passionate about them. Now you know why, okay? So what we're gonna try to do is field some questions. Okay. Listen, you got us fired up, for real. You know, for those of us that were weary, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Tell the truth, okay? So we wanna field some questions. Okay. And then like our other keynote speaker, Mark has some books here, and we'll line up along the wall and try to move you along as quickly as possible. I'll try and work my mic, and I'll take this side, Dan, and you take that side, and then we'll leave you here.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
Test.
We got one over here, Abra.
Hello. You know, we had 9/11, but the public systems in Wisconsin had 2/11. It destroyed our rights. It took away a lot of our money, but it did what the Republicans wanted it to do. It took away our money and our voice, so we could not support the candidates we wanted to. And if we used our voice in the wrong way, our school districts can now fire us. Overnight, no explanations, you're done. So it has effectively silenced too many voices that need to come out. So, how do I get these people who have left the union to come back and say, hey, what you did, that was wrong. But it wasn't just wrong for me. It was wrong for my students and my school district and my community. How do we do that?
Wow, it's a great question. And in many ways, you're answering it. I mean, I think the story that you're offering, the analysis, rather, that you're offering about the impact of this is a story that people need to hear. When, I can speak as an outsider to Wisconsin, but over the last 10 years, covering some of the labor issues that have come here, some of the union issues, some of the school issues, et cetera, there was always an outside sense that the general public was in favor of these changes. That every day, and you're right, you're absolutely right, but that's the public narrative, and part of what we have to do is shift the public narrative. How do you do that? Well, partly through political education. We have to actually go neighborhood to neighborhood, community to community, convincing people that what's at stake is much larger than a particular moment or a particular election. In Philadelphia, recently, there have been huge labor disputes with the school district, and one of the things, and it's like, why are these teachers fighting for having to pay 1% of their health care or 2% of their health care? It's a relatively nominal amount, people say, but they don't understand what's at stake. And if you have a sense of history, you understand that if you've never paid for health care and now you have to start, that's a slippery slope to, why not 5%, why not 10%? And before you know it, it becomes another way to undermine the economic possibility and prosperity of teachers themselves. It's another way to dismantle unions, and once you begin to dismantle unions, all bets are off. Things like, again, you get the arbitrary firing from principals, you get the working instead of, a set number of hours, like 7 or 8 hours, it can come to 12 to 14 hours at times. There, suddenly your employment is tied to test scores and other wildly arbitrary and certainly scientifically unsupportable forms of data, of evidence-based assessment. And so all of these things are part of the conversation, but I think there's too much of a gap between what the experts know, what politicians want, and what everyday people are engaging. And I think we have to do a better job, those of us in the media and those of us who are organizers, to go get to the ground so that teachers and, that parents and students are advocating for these changes as a means of protecting their educational integrity, as opposed to framing it as these teachers want a little bit more money, or these teachers don't want to spend a little bit more money, or these folk don't want to be able to be fired, which are all the public kind of narratives that surround this. We have to empower, and that's what I said during my speech, we have to empower the most vulnerable and the most affected by this to articulate what you just said in the way that you just said it, because that's powerful. That's very powerful. Yeah, thank you. Right here.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. The question that I have pertains to a conversation I had with a friend. And in that conversation, I said that the power shift that will come about in the United States will be the results of a very grassroots movement.
Yeah.
My feeling is that as we face more and more austerity, that people will get to their breaking point.
Yeah.
And I see it with the similar movements with the Yellow Vest movement in France and with the uprising taking place in Hong Kong. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of long history of political and economic theory that would argue that, right? That the contradictions of capital will become so not only simplified but intense that at some point the most vulnerable will resist. The challenge of that is that power is much more sophisticated than I think we initially appreciated. So it's not just a matter of creating dire economic circumstances, because people have been in dire economic circumstances for a long time. The problem is that within the logic of American capital, people still believe they're one hit away. You ever meet somebody at the blackjack table and just feel like, all right, I'm gonna get my money back. I just need one more. And I think oftentimes we imagine ourselves that way as individuals, not as in a collective, but as individuals, right? That I don't want to change the fundamental structure because the fundamental structure allows me to be the billionaire. And as long as I can be, I don't want to live in a system where I can't be a billionaire. That becomes our governing logic. And so part of what we have to do is reinstill in people a sense of the public good. And let me be very clear. I mean, because I don't know, everybody here is different, but in terms of their political and economic orientation, I'm not saying that everybody has to have the exact same outcome. But what I'm saying is I think there's a huge gap between a kind of socialist or communist paradise and a world where 300 people make more than, the 300 richest people make more than the bottom, like 5 billion people, right? Where corporate CEOs make hundreds of times more than their employees. There's a lot of room here. It's not either or, there's a lot of room here. Even if you don't share my exact politics, there's a lot of room here to create more just and equitable circumstances for the vulnerable. We have to convince people that that's the case, that another possibility is on the horizon, and when you do that, you can have the kind of resistance movements you've seen around the globe. But people have to believe that there's something better on the other side. And again, I think too often in this country, and in the West in general, oftentimes, people are not convinced that the other side is any better. And so they will die to defend the wealth and the power of folk who don't wish them well, and sometimes don't even pretend to. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I want to first thank you for giving a voice to the voiceless and saying the things that many of us have felt but have been afraid to say so. My question is, which I have a two-part question, is who do we connect with, and how do we start? Because everything needs a start point, but if we don't know, the people perish for lack of knowledge. And there's a lot of people that hold a lot of power, but they hold it within themselves instead of sharing it with the communities. So if you can give me where to start, who to connect with, I'll be more than happy to lead the baton.
I think a big part of it, first of all, is, I mean, starting at home is important. I don't mean home in the crib. I mean home in terms of your neighborhood, your resources. I mean, I think about the great Russell Conwell, founder of Temple University. He talked about, people going all around the world for riches and wealth. He said there are acres of diamonds in your own backyard. There are so many resources in our community, so many resources in our neighborhoods, and maybe in our own homes that we need to begin with. As a practical matter, join an organization. So many people want to start organizations and lead organizations and be in charge of organizations, but join an organization. Now you may say, well, which organization? I mean, I have my own politics, y'all have your own politics, but I'll tell you, I know for certain in Milwaukee in particular, but just about everywhere, but certainly in Milwaukee, there are organizations that will match all of y'all politics. Join an organization and begin to work. That's how you develop the sort of political education that you need. That's how you develop organizing strategies. That's how you learn how to navigate. And then I think once you do that, I think operating at the intersections of those issues is super important. So for example, if my primary passion is trans rights, and I say, I'm really fascinated. I mean, I'm thinking about this woman in Minnesota, CeCe McDonald. maybe 10 years ago now, a little less than 10, maybe about 7. Cece was a black trans woman who was arrested, charged, tried, and convicted of a crime that I actually think should have been found not guilty of. But regardless of whether you think she was guilty or not, Cece was a black trans woman who was put in a men's prison. Being put in a men's prison as a black trans woman is, I would argue, a form of cruel and unusual punishment. It's a form of torture. It raises all kinds of philosophical questions about the state determining your gender and things like that. But as a practical matter, it makes you almost certain to be sexually assaulted. It makes you almost certain to harassment. It deprives you of resources, medicines. We could go on down the list. Trans rights activists were fascinated by this story. They were obsessed with it, as they should have been, fighting justice for Cece. I became interested in the story, honestly, because I'm a prison abolitionist. And I was working at it from the angle of prison abolition, and next thing I know, I'm partnering and connecting with trans rights activists. And so now there's this interesting intersection. If I'm an anti-prison activist, it's hard to not think about the schools. If I'm an environmental justice activist and you're doing anti-racist work, I gotta look at this relationship between race and the environment. Go to Flint, Michigan. Or Newark, or Milwaukee, or Cleveland. So, what's my point? My point is, we can expand this movement at the intersections, but let's start somewhere. You said where. Quite frankly, anywhere is good. Now, when I say anywhere, very clear, I don't mean anywhere. I mean within the boundaries of the work that you do and the politics that you hold. But start with local organizations. And when you begin with local organizations affecting your own backyard, affecting your own community, affecting your own neighborhood, you get a sense of connection to the issue. But I'll be honest, you also get a sense of satisfaction of actually fixing a problem. As an activist, and I've been an activist for many years, and the thing that keeps us going sometimes is those small victories against the backdrop of so many failures. We lose more than we win. It's like the Packers. Too soon? I know y'all won yesterday, but you know. I'm from Philadelphia. We won a Super Bowl recently.
Next question.
Sorry.
All right, I'm gonna pay off the sports topic.
Had to.
First off, I would like to say hi. My name is Darlene Johns. I am a public ally, so I'd like to shout out all the public allies and public ally alum in the room. Thank you for the work that you do. If you don't know, Public Allies is all about...
I was going to ask if you could say a little bit about what...
Yes. We're an organization that believes that everybody leads. Everyone can be a leader, and we strive to create a just and equitable society, and that has diverse leadership, and that has sustainable leadership. So that's what we are. Everyone here who's a public ally or public ally alum, you associate with public allies, you're a leader, and we appreciate you. So first, I'd like to say thank you for speaking your truth, because the truth that you spoke today resonated with so many of the people in this room, including myself. And then I'd like to say that, or I guess my question is, you're standing here at this conference, which is funded by all kinds of different institutions, with the hashtag #DisruptMKE. Yeah. But what you talked about wasn't just disrupting. What you talked about was dismantling. So I want to hear from you how you feel about what the difference is between dismantling and disrupting, and the importance, I guess, of having both pieces in a movement.
Yeah, you know, it's a good question. You know, I always shy away from the language of reform. I don't believe in warmer and fuzzier prisons, kinder and gentler wars.
Come on.
You know? And so I don't use the language of reform. It's interesting to think about the word disrupt within that context. I don't think of disruption as being different than dismantling. I see them on the same continuum, and one as a process on the way to the other, right? Because I think before you can dismantle something, you have to allow people to know that other worlds are possible. You have to give, Robin Kelly talks about the radical imagination, the black radical imagination. He talks about the freedom dream. There's a wonderful book. It came out maybe 4 months ago by Adom Getachew. It's called World Making After Empire. And it was really looking specifically at some of the international freedom struggles in the 50s and 60s, sort of after kind of the internationalist movements, the Bang Dun Conference, all these other things. Anyway, and the thing was, like, countries like Ghana were fighting for independence. They were fighting to create their own nation states. The countries wanted their own nation states. You saw Egypt in 52. You saw Ghana, is Ghana 57? There's a Ghanaian in here that will tell you. 57, right? There was Sudan, there was Cuba in 59. There were all these nations that were saying, we want our, but her point was that while the nation was the language that was used, they weren't trying to be like traditional Western nation states. They weren't trying to make new empires. They weren't trying to police the boundaries. Nation was just a language they were using, but they were actually trying to imagine new worlds. They weren't trying to empire build or nation build. They were trying to world make. And world making is an ability, is the process of creating new worlds and new possibilities that are based on democracy and justice and freedom and equality. So how do you get to world making from empire? Well, disruption. Sometimes disruption is the physical intervention when you see resistance struggles in Haiti, or when you see a resistance movement in Egypt, or sometimes it looks like Ferguson, right? The uprisings we saw in Ferguson on South Florissant and West Florissant more, the South was tougher. Sometimes disruption is the conversation itself, right? So when Jay-Z says, what's better than one billionaire too, we say, no, what's better than one billionaire is 50,000 people with a living wage. Literally intervene in the conversation with a different conversation. That can be disruptive. Disruptive can say, look, these corporate board meetings aren't enough. We need the vulnerable in the board meeting. Disruptive might say, church, pastor, stop preaching gospels of prosperity. Right? God meant me to drive a Bentley, can't be the move. Creflo theology can't be the move. We need to be talking good news to the poor, freeing the captive. We need a different language. Disrupt. We need to ask the candidates who run for office different questions. And once we disrupt the conversation, we then go about the work of dismantling. But they can happen simultaneously. Because as we're fighting, slaves used to say, pray while running, right? So you got to be able to do both things at the same time. So we're struggling to dismantle and disrupt the conversation, as we also want to dismantle these systems. But we have to convince people that other worlds are possible at the same damn time. That's the word. Yes, and that for me is what dismantling means. That might mean something different to y'all. And disruptive might mean different for y'all. Some people might feel like just saying the world is bad is disruptive. I don't think that disrupts it. Disruptive for me means we have to do something that changes or challenges the status quo. You got to be uncomfortable. Socrates was disruptive. That's what I'm talking about. Where are we looking? I'm getting old.
Hello, Dr. Hill again. I want to add my thanks for your coming here to the growing feelings that I can palpably feel in this room. My first question actually isn't directed towards you, but it was inspired by you, by your sharing your experience and reflecting on what you witnessed firsthand in Ferguson. Mm-hmm. I would challenge everybody in this room to reflect on what our own culpability is for the loss of Dontre Hamilton, whose life was taken us less than a mile away from where we are sitting right now, or if you're from Madison, losing Tony Robinson because of the same structural racism that we have. My second question, kind of challenge, goes into first thanking you for being so optimistic that everybody here in the room has the same level of commitment to alleviating poverty. But I think that
I ain't optimistic, I'm full of hope. Like the blues, you know?
I just let's kind of balance that hope a little bit with an actionable plan of when we go back to our different organizations or we go to confront these institutions who we know for a fact don't have the same level of commitment to bringing that mission to full efficacy, what can we do to not only empower each other in this effort, but also the constituencies that we represent, like the poor, the recently released, recently incarcerated, now back into the rest of the world. All these different constituencies that we reflect. How can we empower each other and, more importantly, empower their voice to confront these systems and institutions?
I think it's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with remaining connected when we leave here. Many of us come here, we connect, we build, we get energized, and we go back to our silos. I think we have to create networks and structures outside of this conference and outside of our respective organizations that operate at the intersections of the respective work you do in education or at the university or at social development or in arts or whatever the thing might be. And I think there's a national movement to do that. Just to give you a concrete example, formerly incarcerated folk, we're doing work, we're doing reconciliation work with juvenile lifers who are now coming home in Pennsylvania. Obviously, the Supreme Court decision that life sentences for teenagers was unconstitutional has resulted in the release of many juvenile lifers, and so we're seeing, just in the last year, we've not me personally, but the city has welcomed maybe 10 or 15 brothers who are in their 40s, 45 years old, 48 years old, who have been incarcerated since they were 14 and 15 years old for crimes. And so this very question has come up, what do we do for them? So it's really been a collaborative effort. The universities have partnered. There have been private resources from companies and corporations that have investments in supporting these gentlemen. But it really has been community action that has said we need to keep our arms of protection around these people. How do we do that? We created an organization precisely for them. But here's the key: it's led by them. We knew these men were coming home, and they created their own leadership networks while still incarcerated. And a brother who's a wonderful brother, his name is Kempis Songster. We call him Ghani Kempis Songster, or Kempis Ghani Songster. Juvenile lifer has come home, and he's doing reconciliation work. He's doing truth and reconciliation work modeled after the South African model. It's led by him, and he's also doing education courses. He's helping to train the brothers who come home now, and they're doing it in partnership. So, for example, I have a bookstore in Philadelphia. They use my bookstore space, right? So I give them the space. They have the meetings. The university provides the economic resources for them. Someone else provides transportation back to the prison so they can continue to connect with their families. All these things. We have job resources that the city is providing, right? That we demanded from them, right? Under the logic of preventing recidivism, although recidivism rates are extremely low for this population of people. People like to pretend that they're not. So, but we're using all these resources to connect. But the key, to answer your question directly, is to have them lead. I think when they're leading and we're all collectively organizing across our organizations, it helps. But we're not depending on the organizations themselves. I don't expect a university to stop being a multinational corporation, which is what they essentially argue. I don't expect an investment bank to stop trying to maximize shareholder wealth. I understand what these institutions are, so we can take things from them when they're useful as a tactic, but our strategy can't be to depend on those big behemoths. Our strategy has to be to depend on the people and to connect at the grassroots level. Yeah.
So real quick, y'all know it's getting close to that time.
Oh.
We have some people that we've committed, Commissioner Johnson, this young woman here, and then there was one person in the back. Dan, do you have somebody? So,
And I'll answer these fast, I promise.
so this is going to be the rapid fire round. Everybody agree?
If you want, we can take all 3 questions at once and I can answer them all. No, I'm serious. Take them all at once. It'll make it better. And I have a feeling the Spirit is moving me to believe that all these questions will be intersecting and connected in such a way that my answer, thank you. Amen.
Yeah, well, my name is Torrey Johnson. I'm an SDC commissioner, and I'd like to just thank you for coming, because, you know, I usually be like saying, oh, y'all finna bring somebody from out of town to tell us something that we always already saying. But I enjoy what you said, because that's what I be saying. You know what I'm saying? Right. You know, and it's hard to get people to understand that, because the simple fact, I've been in prison before. I've been a drug dealer and a user. I've been shot, and I've shot at people. And sometimes when you in the room and you talking to people that ain't did that, and they try to tell you how it's supposed to happen, I be knowing it ain't gonna work. And sometimes I be saying, you don't want it to work. You know what I'm saying? Because you don't want us to do it. You know, I had a meeting, because I also work for Wisconsin Community Service, and my executive director, we got a lovely connection. And I also told him, I said, but we got to be up here. You know what I'm saying? So it can't be like you got me working, but you telling us what to do, because when the people that's behind me see that, they ain't coming. Then I also tell the people like that, you know what I'm saying, actually doing this service, they got to be real too, because some of us is getting paid and just getting paid.
That's
and
it.
We ain't trying to stop nothing either. You know what I'm saying? So I ain't gonna just plug SDC and WCS, but SDC, I went as a commissioner for my district, because I'm elected commissioner. I went to different things that they was doing, and it was so beautiful. And I was like saying that sometimes we got to stop giving the money to just the people that's been there and the people that's actually doing the work.
That's it.
Rapid fire.
Okay. What I was going to say is that there's a strategy that can be utilized for a lot of situations that people might not be aware of. Learn the rules, policies, and procedures of whatever entity or corporation that you work in. And when you learn the rules, policies, and procedures, you can instigate and make a change to anything you want. But because I was in front of this lady, she wants to share a situation in her family with you.
2 years ago, my nephew was shot by the Wauwatosa policeman because he was sleeping in a park. And just like Dontre Hamilton and things that have, what happened in Ferguson, this officer was not charged. Based on the fact, because he knocked on the window and my nephew woke up and he was afraid, and the officer shot and killed him, shot him 6 times.
First, just let me say my deepest sympathy to you and my condolences to you. And it makes me so sad that that story is so common. And we have to find a way, again, to disrupt a system and ultimately dismantle a system that continues to normalize and even codify irrational white supremacist fears of black bodies.
Hello, Dr. Hill. I'm Stanthea Greer. I'm on the SD Foundation Board, and recently. The way that people can become involved is stop being the status quo, because see, you sitting in the most racist state there is, and it is 2019. There is no.
Y'all got some competition now.
What? No, not really, not really, because unfortunately, you might see these people singing Kumbaya in this room right now, but you can go outside right now and ask that same person for a job. They don't know you. So I'ma just keep it real. And they might not like me after tomorrow, George, but it's okay. I got one more thing. How we can disrupt Milwaukee is to disrupt them polls, because the same people that's sitting here saying what the problem is, in Madison, we got people that don't even care about our needs. They come into churches and pimp us with any little program they can, any kind of little grant, and then we don't want to do nothing. And we need to also disrupt our own self, because people of color need to disrupt these wrong people of color who not doing nothing to help Milwaukee.
Thank you. That was the easiest Q&A I ever had in my life.
Praise the Lord, Pastors United. Praise the Lord. I just wanted to stand up and say that we as a people should begin with our children, because I call children record and play. Everything that we do in our house, they hear it, they see it, and that's what the corruption is. And I am really tired of it. If you're not correcting your children, then you are wrong too.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is Julia. I am an immigrant from Mexico. For all the people ask me, I should back home, today I know this is my home. It was forever. The only mean my ancestors moved to Naguar place to move. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, United States of America, to welcome to me. Please welcome all immigrants. God bless America. America bless God. Thank you.
We talked about criminal justice and you being a prison abolitionist.
Yes, sir.
Could you please explain to those who may not be aware what the 13th Amendment is and what the possibilities of rescinding the 13th Amendment and the power of rescinding that amendment?
Are you a pastor? You got a preacher voice.
Can we get past that to the question?
Yes. You definitely a pastor then. When is the building fund gonna come in?
I ain't passing around the plate. Come on, let's focus. The 13th Amendment and how it's impacting the criminal justice system, how it's impacting generations, and if we rescinded the 13th Amendment, how far that would go. Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'd rescind it, but so after what the 13th Amendment does is it eliminates human captivity as a legal possibility. It ends slavery essentially. The problem with the 13th Amendment is that the 13th Amendment also has the exception in it. So it ends all slavery except for penalty of a crime. And so essentially it allows, so the spirit of it ostensibly was that you could still be held captive if you were in prison. The challenge of it is that the prison for a long time was a very different thing. The prison is particularly in the West, is a relatively new way of resolving issues. And initially the prison was not really something largely occupied by black folk. The prisons were in many ways a Quaker project. Think about Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, for example. You know, one of the I think the earliest prison. The penitentiary was a place where you would seek penitence. The root of the word penitentiary is penitence, and the idea was that you could go there and you'd be isolated, you'd get a Bible, you'd have some time to yourself, you could read, you could reflect, and eventually you could return to society. It wasn't, honestly, a terribly bad idea. I would not support it, but it wasn't as bad an idea as it came to be. When you read the writings of Dickens and other folk, you can see how they talk about the American prison. But once you have the emancipation and the 13th Amendment comes along to eliminate slavery except for penalty of a crime, you now have, and this goes right back to the theme of the conference, you have, in terms of poverty, because you now have an American economic infrastructure that was indebted to slavery and human captivity. The South was built, America was built on unpaid black labor. But the South's entire infrastructure, I mean, think cotton, all from the labor of slaves. The North, all the institutions, even slave catchers. all institutions that were connected to what? To human captivity. In the same way now that we have towns that have prisons, and you got towns that have COs, and towns that have surveillance, and towns that have catering and cafeteria and commissary and phone. So there's an entire infrastructure of human captivity that depends on everything. So when the 13th Amendment comes to your question, and they say, wait a minute now, you can still have slavery if you commit a crime, what happens? Everything becomes a crime. So now you have people who were formerly enslaved, they're now free. But those slave codes become what? Black codes. And so you have crimes like vagrancy, cursing. Vagrancy laws meant if you were out of town without a job, you could be locked up. Cursing in front of a woman, you could be locked up. Littering, you could be locked up. Being outside after a certain time, you could be locked up. And so then, because the 13th Amendment said that you could be held captive, those people who were once on plantations are now held captive through the prison, and then they become what they called convicts, and they develop what was called the convict lease system. So those convicts were then leased back to the very same plantations and the railroads and the farms that they were working on as enslaved people. So we simply replicated the conditions of slavery through this newfound prison that now suddenly, that it was black folk in it, looked different. It wasn't about the monastic experience of critical self-reflection. Now you was working. And you developed the system and it expanded. And so we essentially codified a set of practices that reinstituted slavery by other means. And that is why when we look at the 2.3 million people who are caged in American prisons, we make up 5% of the world population, 25% of the prison population. 1 in 100 American adults is incarcerated right now. They want to add juvenile facilities and all that stuff. The number goes up astronomically. A black man in America right now has a 28% chance, of being incarcerated in his lifetime. These numbers are insane. We lock up more black people per capita in apartheid South Africa. So the 13th Amendment becomes the critical framework for normalizing and justifying human captivity by other means. And that is why when I say I operate against the prison, I operate in that same abolitionist tradition. I believe that human captivity is wrong. I believe that we can't cage our way to justice or freedom or safety. We have to invest in people, and we can dismantle the prison brick by brick, wall by wall, free them all. Thank you.